Welcome to the Rational Educator podcast, a weekly look at the world of education with our roundtable of experts. In this, our first episode, we discuss why the world needs a reform of education and what is it about a rational approach that can save your children and the world. Here's the episode. Okay, so we have with us today our regular panel, Dr. Andrew Bernstein and Deanna Heikkinen. Andy, let's start with you. Since this is our first episode, we want to get a sense of who you guys are and what kind of background you bring to this field of education.
Sure, but what about Dr. Deanna? Doesn't she get the like Dr. Jill? To answer your question, Joel, I hold a PhD in philosophy from the graduate school of the City University in New York. I've taught philosophy for 40 years in various colleges, including at Clemson University in South Carolina. American University in Bulgaria, in Blagoevgrad, Bulgaria, was a fascinating year teaching business ethics there. So I have 40 years of teaching experience, mostly in the colleges, some in the high schools. I taught at a prep school, American Renaissance School in White Plains, New York, when I was in grad, for a number of years in the 1980s when I was in grad school. So I have a lot of teaching experience at the college level mostly. But one thing that I could talk about is what I've seen and the decline I've seen in the students who graduate from the high schools and come to college. I think it's been precipitous, especially in the last 10 or 12 years. So I could certainly, discuss that sadly at great length and in depth.
And Deanna, you have kind of a similar reach of a background, and you've seen some of the same issues. What is it that you have experienced in education? What's your background?
Well, I hold a doctorate in education from a teachers' colleges. So I have firsthand experience of what's happening in the teachers' colleges, which has ultimately an impact on what's happening in education. I also taught college for over a decade, and I taught humanities, history, and anthropology. I have a background in Egyptology, so it kind of helped me spread across, but my true love in life is literature. And so it was really nice to be able to teach humanities and expose students who'd never read anything of what we would call classic literature, expose them to those ideas. I also, when I left academia, I started doing some private tutoring. I started a homeschool curriculum company, and I really became more informed on the whole homeschool movement, why people were homeschooling, and really the benefits of homeschooling. I took what I did on the college level and what I learned from what kids really needed from my research in homeschooling, and I apply that to now being a private tutor for kids, elementary school, all the way through high school, and even college if they need it.
Well, so between the two of you, you've connected with thousands of students over the years, and you have a sense of the passage of time and the change in education as well, and the trend that we're seeing with regard to the world of education now. So
yeah, the race to the bottom.
Exactly. It really does feel like it is that. And it's not just higher ed. I mean, this is across the board is what I'm seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just go ahead for a minute, Joel. Something occurred to me while you were speaking about Deanna and I. I'm the philosopher. She's got the doctorate in education. We're like John Dewey and William Hurt Kilpatrick, at Columbia University. Dewey taught in the philosophy department. Kilpatrick, his leading disciple, headed big part of the teachers' college, and between them, they ruined American education. Well, Dr. Deanna and I maybe can do something to reverse that trend.
Well, you can't do any worse than Dewey, so I have faith in you.
Yes, thank you. And by the way, I should mention that I've been tutoring also online. For parents who hire me, actually in Minnesota. I'm in the New York area. Parents hire me in Minnesota. I'm sure we'll get to that at some point. how tutoring can really benefit kids and how parents can hire tutors in person or online. The online part could be anywhere in the world, which is
Absolutely.
great. But anyhow, I just wanted to.
Well, it is true that parents are seeing the need to not just supplement their children's education with tutors, but in many cases replace it or use it to undo the damage that they're seeing in when they have their children go through the traditional school system. And so that brings me to ask the question, just to set the terms of the discussion, because this is going to be a long running discussion. We hope to have many of these podcast episodes about education. And the first question that I want to throw out there for you all is, Andy, you've talked before about how education is the most vital, the most important aspect of a society that needs to be reformed. So can you go on about that? Why is that the case? What is it about education that that makes it so fundamental to a culture?
Well, I mean, I think we should start with human intelligence. That Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, long ago pointed out that man is the rational animal. And our rational faculty, our thinking ability needs to be nurtured and cultivated. And I think I would recommend to all people to read Ayn Rand's great novel, Atlas Shrugged. Ayn Rand, for those who don't know who she was a 20th century writer and philosopher. She wrote, in my judgment, the two greatest novels in world literature, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. And I don't want to discuss the plot in Atlas Shrugged because it's a mystery story. I don't want to give it away. But the theme, that how the mind is mankind's means of survival is beautifully accurate. Like birds have their wings to fly, and lions have their claws and fangs to tear apart their prey, and antelopes have their foot speed to outrun the lions. Well, physically, we can't match up with lions, tigers, and bears, oh my. This is what gets us to the top of the food chain. We have to figure out how to grow food and cure diseases and build houses and invent computers and and software and the internet and everything. The mind is our means of survival, as Ayn Rand shows beautifully in her novel Atlas Shrugged. And the mind needs to be nurtured. It needs to be cultivated. The education, to me, I think, have always thought the fundamental aspect of education should be intellectual training the mind in thinking. And the basic thinking skills, reading, writing, math. And so I think reading and writing are by far the two most important subjects that need to be taught in school. And we know the method to teach reading. It's not a mystery. Systematic phonics has worked for centuries. And yet the American educational establishment, Arthur Bestor, the historian, wrote a famous book in 1950s, Educational Wastelands. He refers to what he calls the interlocking directorate, the teachers' colleges, the state departments of education, the federal departments of education, and the superintendents, principals, and administrators of the local schools. He calls that the interlocking directorate. They're the power in American education. And for a long time, they have militated for 100 years, going back to John Dewey, over 100 years now. They've militated against the use of phonics in the teaching of reading. One thing we can immediately do to improve American education is to use phonics and only phonics to teach reading. You're going to see reading scores go way up, and kids are going to have the most important thinking skill of all, reading. Because as fluent readers, then the whole world of books, the whole world of knowledge is open to them. So that's one thing right away we can do to train the mind, is use phonics and only phonics to teach reading. And I think we should focus much more on writing than we do in the schools. But that's a good start. To answer your question, why is education so important? Because it trains the mind, mankind's survival instrument. And in the present context, the educational establishment, the interlocking directorate, as Arthur Bestor refers to it, is opposed to academic training. They're horrified by the thought that should be the focus of education. They want to teach practical skills and vocational training and everything but academic training. let me make one last point. I know Dr. Deanna's gonna have a lot of things to say. It should be no mystery why American students over and over and over again for decades now score badly on international academic tests relative to kids from other countries. The reason American kids score badly on academic subjects is the American schools don't teach academic subjects, not nearly to the extent or the depth that they should. And why not? Because the interlocking director, the teachers' colleges who teach their teachers don't want them to know these subjects. Why is a whole, question we could get into. But
Deanna, I know that,
they
Deanna,
don't.
I know that you as a survivor of a teacher's college program have something to say about that. What can you add to what Andy just said?
Well, it's really interesting. I have a couple thoughts that really kind of formulated as you were talking. One is that you kept on pointing to your mind, and specifically this frontal lobe, and this is my anthropology background coming out. It's this frontal lobe that makes us so different from any other animal in the animal kingdom. This is what separates us from everything else. This is our mind, this is our cognitive ability that goes beyond anything else, even primates, even chimpanzees that are very intelligent. We have this extra ability in our thinking. And even Aristotle, you mentioned Aristotle, even he makes that distinction that plants can only do this, animals can only go up to this level, but it's the rational man that can go beyond just survival or coming up with just enough ingenuity of, say, chimpanzees will use sticks or a little bit of tool making. And there's been a lot of debate in the primatology academic world of whether or not they're making up tools and they're really a tool maker and creator, or are they just using what's available. And so we see this in the animal kingdom, but really it's the human's ability to think. That is our gift. That is the extra, this little part in our brain here in this front. That's what we have that nothing else on the planet has. And for me, having gone through teachers' colleges, and there's such a stress on, we have to teach critical thinking. We have to teach kids how to think critically. No, you cannot teach critical thinking. What you do, like what Dr. Bernstein said, you teach them how to read using phonics. That is critical thinking. That is teaching them how to start taking, abstract letters and then forming them into these concepts called words and sentences and ideas. And it's this process that's completely missing from teachers' colleges and from the education system. I grew up in the 70s. I went to, I was public school educated all the way up through my doctorate. I was lucky. My mom moved us specifically to areas where there were good schools. She did her due diligence. And I was lucky for that. So I was taught using phonics. I was taught using these more traditional, what we call traditional methods, or even some would argue archaic methods of teaching. And I'm really glad that my mom was able to do that. And, it seems like a lot right now for parents that, I don't have time. Every pretty much household has to have two incomes in order to survive in the modern world, unfortunately. So I get that. But phonics is, I totally agree with you, is primary on getting kids able to think critically. And that's the big, one of the big buzzwords. They have to think critically. And so what they do in the schools is they bring in all this activism, which is political and is really not teaching kids to think critically. It's just telling them how to think. And that's, I think, the big difference is that their teachers now are not trained and are not even driven to teach kids how to look at something, understand it, read it, and come up with their own ideas. They're given things to fill their minds with ideas. They're not challenged to think the way that, school has been for not millions, but for, hundreds of years. I mean, going back to the Roman Trivium, the ancient Greeks, this is how children were taught. And that's what's missing. And, I know in other countries, in Asia in particular, their test scores are through the roof. In Finland, they have better test scores, and there's been a lot of research on why that is. And some of it does come to these methods that are being taught over there. Also, the cultural moire of education has a much higher value in those societies. And in our society, it seems that education isn't really highly valued. And I think that's kind of that's a big issue to get into, but looking at kind of why that is, why aren't teachers heroes? And I think hero is something we're going to keep on going back to, because I know the three of us are all hero worshipers.
Yes.
But teachers, at one point, like when I was growing up, my teachers were my heroes. They were some of my heroes. I really looked up to them. I respected them. And I think that's missing a lot too.
Let me jump in here for a second.
Mhm.
What you said was really important there, Deanna, Dr. Deanna. American schools today teach kids more what to think than how to think. And it raises a suspicious question to me, and that is, if they sincerely want kids to engage in critical thinking, why do they repudiate the one method that works in teaching reading? Phonics. It doesn't add up. There's something, that doesn't smell right.
There is something that
nefarious.
there is something that I wanted to press here, and that was if the question on the table is, why is education the most important aspect of our society that needs to be reformed, it implies that it has effects in a culture that what is being presented in our education system has a demonstrable effect on our culture at large. And one of the things that you said, Deanna, is that the politicization of the classroom has led to events and has shaped the minds of students. So when they become adult, then we have a culture that politicizes everything.
Yeah, one prominent example is critical race theory.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to see a lot of parents, immersing themselves in this issue, coming to realize how racist CRT is and speaking out against it. But your point, Joel, for many years now, they haven't taught much history in the schools. 100 years ago, they did away with history. They created some weird hybrid called social studies, which in many cases could be anything that a given school district wants it to be, or even an individual teacher wants it to be. And they've taught very little history, including American history. And some school districts are better than others, like Deanna said. Some teachers are better than others, and I know there are still a lot of good classroom teachers in the government schools. A 2 thumbs up for them, but they don't teach much history, including American history. And when they do teach American history, too often they're using textbooks like Howard Zinn, who was a Marxist intellectual and a member of the Communist Party, by the way.
Deanna is in pain right now at the mere mention of Howard Zinn's name.
Yeah, if you're familiar with Harry Potter, he's Voldemort for me. That he should not be named.
All right, sorry, but they're using textbooks like that, written from a Marxist standpoint, and so the American history they get is mostly the evils of America. They discuss slavery, which is very real and very evil and needs to be taught. They discuss, racism in American history, which is very real, Jim Crow, segregation, brutal lynchings and persecution of Black American citizens who were denied their basic right as American citizens to even vote. All of that's real and needs to be taught. But what gets pushed aside is all the greatness of America. The founders some of them were slave owners. The Virginians were slave owners. That's true. The Northern founders were all abolitionists. And even the Virginians were abolitionists, theoretically. And because the principle of individual rights that the country was founded on, that my life belongs to me and Deanna's life belongs to Deanna and so forth, and our lives do not belong to the state. The principle of individual rights is what led to an abolitionist movement in this country and ended up, ending slavery with the 13th Amendment in 1865. None of this, or very little of this, gets taught. And so the fact that slavery exists around the world to this day, and I mean legally, every communist country uses massive amounts of slave labor. North Korea may be a primary example. In the Islamic world, the enslavement of non-Muslims is legal. In Sudan, there are thousands and thousands of black slaves, mostly Christians. They don't get, the kids mostly don't get taught this. And so the politicization, as you say, the kids come out of high school into the colleges, and America's evil. It's an evil, racist nation. Systemic racism is still real in America. White people are inherently racist. They've been taught this coming through the schools, and they have no idea of the full context of American history. They know the bad things about American history. They know very little about the good. I'll just give you one example. Last year, right before we went online because of COVID, I was in class, college class, 20 kids, makes the arithmetic easy, 20 kids in the class. 10 of them out of 20 had some idea, had heard the name James Madison. They had some idea who he was. They know he was president of the United States. The other 10, fully half the class, had never heard of him. James Madison. I had to pick my jaw up off the floor. Even the 10 who had heard of him knew he was a president. They didn't know that he was the lead author of the US Constitution, virtually the sole author of the Bill of Rights. They don't teach it. It's not the kids' fault. They don't teach it.
It's very
shocking. It's shocking.
It's very shocking, and it's very true. And it's interesting when you were talking about those groups that control education, from the feds to the states to the superintendents and down to principals. There was one that I would have added to that, and probably post 1950 when that was written, I would say the textbook companies, because textbook companies have a lot of power, particularly states, California, Florida, Texas, New York. They influence textbook companies, and textbook companies don't want to write a different textbook for each state. And so if you have a state that wants certain things out of the history, like we're not going to teach about Jefferson anymore, which is what California wants, because he's a slave mover and he's a racist. But this is what California was doing. And then they will rewrite the textbooks. And then that's what they're distributing. So the textbook companies have a lot of power also, which are pushed by those entities within the states. And so it's really interesting. I did similar experiments in my classrooms. I taught humanities, and I had different themes that I could focus on. And so I taught a unit on the Harlem Renaissance, and students, and I taught in LA. So there were, students of all different ethnicities. And there were Black students that had never really even heard of the Harlem Renaissance. They didn't know Langston Hughes. They didn't know the first female millionaire in America was a Black woman in that era, right? Madam C.J. Walker. Yeah. Yes, she's one of my heroes. Yeah. They had never, and so this is history that is just not taught, because it's not about bringing and raising, elevating hero status. It's about tearing down, and that's what education celebrates now. It's sort of the celebration of the victim is what I'm seeing everywhere. And it wouldn't be in my class, but I had colleagues that really, that's what they were pushing, was how much bad and horrible. And it's like, college classes shouldn't be like what you're seeing on the news in the evening, where it's horrible story after horrible story. Yes, wars happen. Yes, bad things happen in the past, but you can also sprinkle in really powerful, impactful stories about heroes, about wonderful things that have happened in the past when you're teaching history. And, I've been called Pollyanna my whole life. And I am a bit of a Pollyanna. I'm an optimist. I want to look on the bright side. But I think that that's really important. And that's also a really big part of education that is just not missing. Kids aren't being exposed to heroes, whether it's from history or literature or even mathematics. I mean, I privately tutor a 7th grader, and he's reading primary source material from Copernicus because he thinks he's really cool. And that's those moments, that's what's missing. I think the biggest thing. And I think that would be the biggest impact on making that change in education, is instead of having the entire world being about, victims and these horrible things, but let's just celebrate really positive things at the same time.
Dr. Deanna, I would jump in here for a second and say, even on the network news, they should do that, because with all the wars and bad things going on in the world, even so, right now, as we speak, somebody's working on a cure for cancer. somebody is writing a great novel. Somebody's making advances. Somebody's is getting ready to go to Mars, namely Elon Musk,
Right.
SpaceX. All these things should be big news. And you're right. The great heroes of history who've carried us forward, made all these advances, cured diseases, and figured out, how to grow crops and feed millions of people. The founders of America who established a free society, whatever their flaws, they established this great society. They should be celebrated. Can you imagine deleting Thomas Jefferson from the American history programs statewide? It's just.
Or only focusing on the fact that he was a slave owner and that's his contribution to America. The end. It's insanity. It really is insanity what's happening.
It's not just insanity though, because would you say that there's an agenda behind it? Because it does seem to be more than just select individuals doing this.
I do think it's an agenda, and again, coming out
not in a conspiratorial way, right? And there's no James Bond villain twirling a mustache and petting a hairless cat. We're not talking about.
There's no Blofeld. There's no Blofeld.
Yeah, there's no Blofeld. Well, there's no Blofeld that we know of, but
actually there is. His name was John Dewey.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Well, and
the
Kant, villain.
I mean, pick one.
Yeah, I mean, when I say agenda, I mean an ideological agenda, a set of ideas that has become a cultural force that originates in thinkers of the past, and we will be, exploring those ideas in the course of time.
Right. Just let me jump in here for a second. For people who haven't read Ian Fleming's great James Bond novels, and I strongly recommend them. I think, although they're great, I don't want to give stuff away, but Blofeld was a terrific villain in a number of Ian Fleming's James Bond books. So I think
I'll add them to my very vast, large, always growing TBR pile. Then
to be read.
Yeah.
I understand. Well, there's definitely an agenda here. We should discuss it at length on numerous shows. Doesn't need a conspiracy because there's something much more powerful involved than any conspiracy could ever be, and that's a philosophy, a widely held, widely shared philosophy. I mean, there's so many people involved in deliberately dumbing down the American educational system. Where would they hold their covert meetings? In the Grand Canyon? I mean, there's nothing covert about this.
It's true, and I think about, I'll continue to go back to my own experience, but when I was in the teachers college, there were some really nice, very sweet people, and they just don't know. They don't really fully, I don't think that they've been exposed to ideas and philosophy to begin with. So they just kind of ride the wave, and this is how it's done, and this is what we do. And they don't necessarily question. And one thing that I've actually learned from Joel is that you can't always fault somebody for that. That they're, they themselves, particularly some of these younger teachers, they're a product of their own education and culture, and they don't know any different, and they've never been taught to question. And so that makes me sad, because there are some really just good people that don't know better. And, you can say, oh, well, they should question and they should do these things, but it's not even in their worldview. Would never even occur to them.
I do think that it's, just to add another twist to that, I think that that's excusable, or it is more excusable the younger you are. But as you get exposed to, your larger experiences, when you start to run into reality, and if you continue to cling to ideas that are simply not working or cause great harm and pain in people like your students, then there's a point at which that is unforgivable.
And there are classroom teachers who stand up to it. There are some who where the local school district wants reading to be taught by some version of the word method, and I'm sure we'll get into all the details of what that means. But it doesn't work. It's got a century of failure. We know it doesn't work, and they don't want the kids to use phonics. They don't want the kids to sound out the words, and their teachers will stand up to it and smuggle in phonics into their classroom, and their teachers will smuggle in American history and tell the full truth about American history. That some of the founders, the Virginians, were slave owners, but they also did all these great things. And the principle of individual rights, by the way, Thomas Jefferson, by the way, just happens to mention in the Declaration of Independence,
right,
is what's fundamental in leading to an abolitionist movement. And so, teach the full context, the full truth about American history, and their heroes and heroines who stand up to. There were teachers who we know who smuggled in the evolution back in the day when various Bible Belt states banned the teaching of evolution. Some of these teachers are real heroes and heroines. And you got to wonder if you teach in the early grades and you see the whole word method, whether it's look, say, or whatever it is, it doesn't work. And you wonder about then. If you just how much do you care about your kids' education if you just go along with a miserably failed method and don't stand up for the kids' education, and stand up for phonics. But there are heroes who do.
Well, they are, but the problem is that they have to smuggle it into their curriculum. They can't teach it openly and proudly. They have to sneak around, and that's really the problem. And I think that it's a kind of corruption that erodes and eats away at teachers that submit to it for an extended period of time. I think it has to be impossible over a long enough time frame to not realize that these methods are not only not working, but they're leading to great pain and hardship. And to continue to do it, and I do understand that in the state of our world today, as Deanna mentioned earlier, you need 2 incomes in order to have a working household and to be able to have children in a city. So I understand that there are external factors that might cause someone to want to cling to the job that's killing them. But on the other hand, that has to come at great cost to their sense of self-worth and integrity.
Yeah, I was just, while you were speaking, Joel, I was reminded of something said by the late, great Walter Williams. And if people don't know Walter Williams, he was a Black American economist, Dr. Walter Williams. He was a strong supporter of capitalism. Today he'd be labeled a conservative, but he was a strong supporter of capitalism. And I saw some reference he made a couple of years ago. He died, I think, last December in his mid 80s. But he made a reference to Frederick Douglass High School in Baltimore, where I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like, the graduates that year, 2018, maybe it was a few years ago, 3% tested at grade level in reading and 0 at grade level in math. So 3 out of 100 were reading in the 12th, 3 out of 100 high school graduates that were reading at 12th grade level, and not 1 out of 100 were at 12th grade level in math. I said, what is going on in the schools? You can't be that bad. If you're really trying to educate the kids, it can't possibly, you would think it can't possibly be that bad. There has to be something deliberate going on. Now, granted, there's drugs and there's crime and there's discipline problems, but still, something severely wrong in the school system that churns out those kind of numbers.
Yeah, we happen to have someone in our trio here today who's done a little bit of research on the history of philosophy. Actually, both of you have on the history of education. So I am absolutely certain that we will come back to why these circumstances have come to be in the course of this podcast. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit, and we've kind of hinted at the answer to this question in our discussion of proper um, pedagogical methods like phonics. But I want to ask this from a wider perspective because the name of the show is The Rational Educator. What does it mean to be a rational educator? What does that consist of?
Well, that's a deep question, Joel. But certainly to me, it goes back to what we were saying before, that the one fundamental point is that the purpose of education is to train the rational faculty, is to train the mind. I'll give you an example because I wrote an essay on this a few years ago, Heroes and Villains in American Education, that was published in the Objective Standard. And I'm writing a book, by the way, Why Johnny. Let me mention Rudolph Flesch here, because there may be people who in our audience who need to learn who he was. Rudolph Flesch wrote a famous book, 1955, Why Johnny Can't Read. And he was an Austrian immigrant. He pointed out there were no reading problems in European countries. There were no reading problems in America until roughly post-World War I era. And the reason is in the European countries, they used phonics to teach reading. In America, prior to World War I, they used phonics to teach reading. After World War I in America, they got away from phonics for look-say and various versions of what they call the whole word method, which we'll discuss. But it's a failed method. And Flesch's book galvanized a number of parents. And for a while, phonics was back in vogue, but not for long enough. So my book is titled Why Johnny Still Can't Read or write or understand math, and what we could do about it. So this is so I wanted to reference reference Rudolph Flesch here. So when we talk about my book, we'll know where that's coming from. But yeah, the villains in American education, and Deanna mentioned John Dewey a number of times. They're horrified by, this goes back at least 100 years. They're horrified by the thought that intellectual training is the purpose of education. And back in that day, it's only got worse since, but Dewey taught in the philosophy department at Columbia University. William Hurd Kilpatrick, his leading disciple, headed the Teachers College, or at least maybe it was the philosophy of education department at Teachers College, considered him at Columbia University, considered himself Dewey's leading disciple. And they were absolutely opposed to that practical skills and wanted to get American kids in the cities ready to work in the factories, American kids in rural areas to work on the farms, practical skills, overtly. What's the value of American kids in 1920 something learning Shakespeare's tragedies? How's that gonna help a plumber? How's he gonna be a better plumber because he knows Shakespeare and so on? And the one example I want to raise is Mortimer J. Adler, Robert Maynard Hutchins, University of Chicago. They developed a great books program that the real education should consist of you're training the mind by means of reading the classics of Western civilization. Every tradition, and every philosophic tradition, and literature and history and the sciences and psychology, and so forth. And the progressives, Dewey, Kilpatrick, and those guys just went ballistic. Diane Ravitch, great historian of American education, wrote a great book, Left Back.
Yep.
And she it is great. And she points out, it's jaw-dropping what these guys, Dewey, Kilpatrick, and the leaders of the so-called progressive movement that were opposed to academic training, opposed to intellectual training, what they said. They claimed Adler and Hutchins were fascists. Because they wanted to train the mind. That there was such a thing as the truth. And they wanted the kids to learn how to think. They're just militantly opposed. The founders of what American education is today, and John Dewey's got to be the guy. He's the arch villain here. They're opposed to intellectual training. They're opposed to it. They'll fight to the death. And 100 years later, they still, they may disagree today on what the positive aspects of schooling should be, but they all agree on one negative thing. It's not about training the mind. It's not about academic subjects. It's not about teaching the kids how to read. They may have different ideas on what they should do, but they all agree on what they should not do. And it's just, and that's why the kids don't score well on academic subjects. They don't believe in teaching them, and they don't. It's just, it's really horrifying. It really is.
It is. And just to piggyback on that, so for me, I think rational educator is to first know that students need to have informational like knowledge. They need to learn how to read. They need to memorize things. Like I had to memorize great documents and poems, and what that did, and I'm talking little first, second, third grade, all the way through elementary school. What that does is that it sort of plants these little seeds, and you may be memorizing just for the sake of memorizing something. I had to memorize Paul Revere's Ride, a part of it, right? And then later, when I was learning the history of the Revolution, later in elementary school, that poem I could remember. And so it provided context. So what these sort of old-fashioned skills are doing for kids is that they're planting little seeds, and then those seeds get watered when they go to another grade and they revisit that information, and then they go, and it allows their brain to follow the normal human development. I mean, humans have longer gestation period. We have to nurture our young longer than any other animal in the animal kingdom. We, at a year old, we're not self-sufficient. That's not the case in the animal kingdom. And so our brain takes a lot longer to form. And so you're not teaching a 3-year-old calculus, because there are many concepts that they have to learn to lead up to that. If you've ever seen, I grew up in a small town, and if you've ever seen a horse get born, boom, they're up and running very shortly after. That doesn't happen with humans. And so the brain is very similar to our physical. Like we don't just start walking, we crawl first. And so we have these little steps. And so for an educator to be rational, they need to understand that. And one thing that's happened, and I'm going to add another name to your villain list, Andy, is Paulo Freire. He kind of put in this idea saying that education should be about teaching activism and teaching, like sort of politicizing education. He's the one that really introduced that. And so now what you have are first graders learning about different political movements. And I'm just going to throw this out there. There are first graders, second graders, third graders that are now using BLM curriculum. Like there are teachers that are being mandated to use BLM curriculum, which is a Marxist curriculum, to these kids and it's not a fault of their own or anyone's. They just cannot understand those concepts the same way that you wouldn't teach a first grader calculus. You've got to start with addition and subtraction and then go into fractions and build up to it. And so what I think a rational educator is somebody who fully understands that and understands that what information different levels of students can understand. And I'm not talking where it's fully student centered and then, they can drive all of the education. There are so many different sort of pedagogical schools on how to educate, but I'm talking about just understanding the fundamental differences between a first grade or a 7-year-old brain versus a 17-year-old brain. And that I think is so missing in curriculum and understanding, and it's not even addressed in teachers' colleges to my knowledge.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dr. Deanna. That's the hierarchy, and the order in which things are taught. That's a big part of rational education. And there's some things, like you said, Deanna, some things have to come first. You wouldn't start a first grader with algebra. It's going to go way over the head. You got to start with arithmetic. And similarly in literature, I think kids should be reading great children's books when they're very young. Peter Pan, The Secret Garden, Anne of Green Gables, and then you work your way up to to deeper and deeper reading until by the time they're in high school, and the kids can be reading Shakespeare and Dostoevsky. It should be Shakespeare and Dostoevsky and Victor Hugo and Tolstoy and Sophocles and all the great writers in world literature. But you have to build up. There's got to be a prioritized list to.
And this is not new, by the way. This is not or rather, the the idea of teaching in terms of hierarchy and ever growing levels of complexity is not new. This is how education was over 100 years ago. And so what we're proposing here is not revolutionary.
No.
The wheel does not have to be reinvented here. Now, I do want to
Just to be corroborate what you said, Joel. We have a lot of evidence, proxy data, showing how good American education was prior to the imposition of government schooling, roughly 1850s, in the mid 19th century. One indicator are the McGuffey's readers. Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable in today's context how advanced they are. Third and fourth, I can't remember off the top of my head, but third and fourth grade readers with very, very advanced vocabulary. I remember the term benighted was like in the third or fourth grade reading. My college kids don't know what benighted.
It's very true. When I was working on our homeschool curriculum, I ended up using those old readers and old textbooks from over 100 years ago. PD, pre-Dewey. So I tried to find books from the late 1800s and then use that to help model our curriculum for our leveling for the homeschool curriculum. And it was really informative.
Yes, well, the one little factoid that always just blows my mind is that the essays of the Federalist, written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay in support of the fledgling Constitution, for largely newspaper editorials to be read by every man. The Federalist, I mean, that's very sophisticated political theory. I'm sad to say, I think many, maybe most American college graduates today would really struggle with the essays of the Federalist. Late 18th century, that's what people read in the newspapers.
And just a shout out, if you want to try reading the Federalist, start with number 10, in my opinion.
That was Madison, right?
Yeah.
It's famous. Yeah, famous. Okay. Can't argue with that.
All right. So I want to wrap this up with just to emphasize the point about the rational part of the rational educator. What does it mean to be a rational educator? And to me, that means a method of teaching that allows a student to become rational by showing them examples throughout the course of their education that emphasize the possibility of rationality. And by that I mean, I don't mean that a first grader should be presented with complex syllogisms at that age, but every level of education can be it can be a reason or a way to present yet another example of consistency, causality, and rationality. And that example over time, and as Deanna mentioned, there are many virtues of the method of memorization in a curriculum, in a teaching process. But if you're memorizing things that have a connection to other things that you will learn later, what you're demonstrating is the validity of causality, that the universe does work in a causal way. It's possible to make connections, to connect the dots, if you want to put it that way. And rather than what we see today, which is, I think we can all agree that we frequently see in the education system a sense of disintegration, a disconnection of things from other things. And part of a rational education has to be the presentation of all these facts and all of these things that need to be memorized in such a way that reason, rationality, consistency, and causality are implicit. They can be implicitly taken from what they're presented with. And that's the purpose of rational education. So, Andy, let me have a comment for you before we sign off, and then Deanna.
Yeah, I was just thinking, because I've been writing on this, why Johnny still can't read. And even, literature and the arts are too often thought of as being emotional or emotionalist disciplines, and they're not rational. Well, I agree with the emotional part. I always tell my students, there's no such thing as too much emotion. Emotion is good. It's how we live. It's how we experience life. There's no such thing as too much emotion, but there is such a thing as too little reason or too little rationality. And so I would teach literature right from whenever we start, preschool, kindergarten, first grade. We're reading great kids' books. We're reading The Secret Garden, let's say, and all the way through high school when we're reading King Lear or Macbeth or some great Shakespeare tragedy. I point out to the kids, look, we're going to interpret what this means, but not all interpretations are created equal. The events of the story and the characters who perform those events, those are the facts of this universe. Those are the facts of the author's universe, just as observable facts of where science begins. And any interpretation of stories got to be backed up by evidence from the text. And that's facts, just the facts, ma'am. We're building theories or interpretations of what the story means by reference to facts. And that is a critical component of reasoning. And we'll be learning that in literature, supposedly the artsy, very emotion-based subject. We'll be learning it in literature, as well as in science and in mathematics and in history. Again, history, same thing. These are the facts of what happened. What does it all mean? Why was this revolution? What caused this war? How do we change from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance? Here are the facts. Now we need a theory to explain the facts, and the theory has to be grounded in the facts. So we're reasoning all along. We may not even call it reason in the early grades, but that's what we're doing. It's like you said, Joel, the kids are learning it implicitly. By the time we get to 12th grade, I think the kids should have so much history and literature by that time that 12th grade history class could be a history of Western philosophy, certainly as an elective. And with when we get to Aristotle, a whole section on logic. The kids have already been trained to think, whether like that character in Moliere, they've been speaking prose their whole life without realizing it. Well, the kids have already been reasoning without realizing, explicitly what reason is. And in the Aristotle section of the history of Western philosophy class, we could make it explicit. So absolutely, train reasoning. That's a big part of what a rational education is all about.
Yeah, and I think that it's also the case that there's been a huge backlash against non-STEM related subjects in schools. There's been a great deal of money and resources placed in the STEM fields by businesses and as well as educators, because they understand that there's a huge deficit of American students who have the skills to be able to work in these kinds of industries. And
by the way, Joel, for people who don't know what STEM is, you might want to
science, technology, engineering, and math. Those fields, we see all kinds of activities that have come into existence over the last 10 years or so, because there's a growing understanding that students lack these basic reasoning skills, and the belief is that it can only be learned by creating an emphasis on the STEM fields. Exactly. As you said, literature and history. I think it's not very well understood, particularly in the education fields, that literature, great literature, has a very scrupulous, tight cause and effect structure that can be that you can learn rationality from, even if the characters are behaving irrationally. the
Yeah.
universe of literature contains those kinds of causal effects if it's great literature. You know,
Let me
there's
say
also
one
bad
last,
literature.
let me say one last thing. As great as STEM is, I'm all for science and technology and mathematics and everything, but reading and writing are the two basic cognitive skills. No matter what profession anybody goes into, butcher, baker, candlestick maker, that's what's training the mind to reason. Those are the skills, that we really have to focus on, and in all courses that we teach. And one last point is, Robert Maynard Hutchins, great books guy, along with Mortimer J. Adler, pointed out, this goes back, I don't know, circa 1930. You see, talk about practical vocational skills. He said for students who come out of the high schools and have been properly trained, in academic subjects, and their reading and writing skills are very strong. They can be trained by employers and on-the-job training in the practical vocational skills in a matter of months, maybe even weeks. You could take people who read and write superbly, and you could train them, in all kinds of practical skills. And Hutchins is right about that. Not to denigrate STEM. That's, math skills, science knowledge, that's all very important. I do think reading and writing are the most fundamental cognitive skills that the schools need to focus on.
And as you mentioned before about literature can make our hearts sing. They can inspire and make us feel things that it is possible to feel great emotion with achievements that you make or that you see other people make in the STEM fields, but literature is designed for that, and that's why it needs to be part of a basic educational curriculum.
Yeah, it's fundamental. It's fundamental, the reading and writing skills.
Deanna, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Well, being the optimistic Pollyanna, there are some areas that are starting to focus on STEAM instead of STEM, and they've added arts in there to realize that that is the missing part of all of this technical training and this sort of focus on math and science, that there are some people that are looking at the research where they can see that music, for one thing, is very important, that if you're learning music in tandem with learning some math concepts, they're very much that helps activate parts of the brain that can help people students do better in math. So music is something. They're also learning that other things in the arts are helpful. And so some places have STEAM instead of STEM. And so it's nice to see that, I think, and when I teach history, I always talk about the pendulum swing. You go from one extreme to the other extreme, back and forth. We never seem to land in the middle. But maybe people in education are starting to understand that, history and literature and art and music and all of these, sort of soft skills, or things that build what we call soft skills, are fundamentally important. Now, I don't think they're the people that are making decisions and are, backing things with money, because there are still colleges that are cutting history departments, literature departments, classics departments. Those are being cut left and right still in American colleges, which really breaks my heart. For more programs in engineering, or they talk about low enrollment, and so they'll still have a history class, but it's just a gen ed and they don't offer a history degree. And so there's all of these things that are happening in education, but there are these little glimmers of light that I also see out there. So hopefully things will get better. I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast is, we can sit and talk about everything negative, but we wanted to also give some options for parents, and maybe give some little glimmers of hope for people who have kids or who have young kids that haven't even started school yet. And so that's my little glimmer of hope for the day, is that there are certain little areas, little pockets that are starting to see the value of art again. And then I think that will only expand.
And we will certainly be talking about these things over the life of this podcast, along with the the good. We will examine why we got to the place where we need to have the good over the bad. But until then, Andy, where can we find you on social media, and how can people get in touch with you and find your work?
Well, the first thing they could do is they go to my website, which is andrewbernstein.net, and all my books are up there, including my recent book, Heroes, Legends, Champions: Why Heroism Matters. And I know we're all hero worshipers. We'll be talking about the need for heroes in literature, for kids. So my website, andrewbernstein.net, is certainly a good place to start.
Thank you for appearing on the show, Andrew Bernstein and Deanna Heikkinen.
You're very welcome, Joel. Thank you. And this is going to be a weekly show, so we will meet again shortly.